I'm Benjamin Hall, and I'm searching for heroes. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. I wanted to start today's episode by giving a huge thank you to all of you who sent me kind messages following the release of my new book, Resolute: How We Humans Keep Finding Ways to Beat the Toughest Odds. I spent the last week in New York City promoting it, and I am, frankly, overwhelmed with gratitude that I got to speak with so many incredible people for this book and that I get to share it with all of you. So if you read it, please let me know what you think. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts, and I really hope that you enjoy it. And speaking of humans who have beat the toughest odds, I really couldn't think of a better guest to have on the podcast today, because James Dold, the man who joins me today, has done exactly that. He's a child abuse and trafficking survivor who has dedicated his life to supporting and advocating for children who have been through similar traumatic experiences. Not only has James passed over 40 new anti-human trafficking laws across the country, but he's also the founder and CEO of Human Rights for Kids, a non-profit organization dedicated to protecting the human rights of children and ensuring the criminal justice system treats children who have suffered abuse and trauma fairly. I could continue going on about all the great things that James has done and continues to do, but I'm going to let him tell you all for himself. I hope you guys enjoy it.
We really rely on the research here that's been done by the psychiatry community, and specifically, there was a study that was created back in 1999 called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, and basically it looked at these 10 specific traumatic events that can happen in a person's life. Now, that study was specifically done to try to predict or understand the relationship between childhood trauma and negative health outcomes later on in life. But since then, this study has been replicated in a variety of different fields, looking at the relationship between trauma and poor educational outcomes, other poor health outcomes like smoking, drug use, alcohol addiction, etc. And what we can say, pretty definitively now is that there is this very strong relationship, right? So if people were to ask me, what's the number one predictor, or what's the number one adverse childhood experience to predict whether or not a child's going to end up in the justice system, it's coming from a broken home. It's not having two parents in the house, right, to provide that stability. And oftentimes that is part and parcel of a larger context, because what we see with those kids is that they oftentimes have witnessed domestic violence. They've been subject to substance abuse in the home. There's oftentimes parental or household incarceration, right? So there's not just like this one thing where it's like, oh, they come from this home where, there's not two parents, because a lot of kids come from, broken homes and they can turn out just fine, right? But it's like when you look at all of these other traumas and they compound, and particularly when you see young people whose traumas, especially abuse, is inflicted by one of their parents, that's the thing that oftentimes sets this off, where you see kids really end up, gravitating, whether it's towards the streets or gangs or, to an older adult that they're seeking for, protection. And this is also how traffickers operate, right? So, human traffickers in general are always looking for those children who also come from those same exact environments where they've been oftentimes subject to prior sexual or physical abuse, because the child is looking for somebody to take care of them. And children, they're going to find love and protection and belonging somewhere, right? If they don't get that in their nuclear home with their family, they're going to find it in the arms of a trafficker. They're going to find it in the streets. And that's kind of the connection between all of that. And that's how we kind of look at this, as part of a larger, really, indictment of our failure to protect children in the first place.
One of the reasons that you are so involved with this is because you yourself went through this when you were young. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your own experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for like a lot of trafficking survivors, what made me vulnerable started really early on in my childhood. So I, was born into a situation where my mother was had a severe drug addiction. And I was in a home where, you would probably describe as a drug house early on in my life. I had a little bit of stability after that. I had the man who raised me as my father was a really great man. But, those, unfortunately, that doesn't always sort of provide the layer of protection that kids need. And I ended up being sexually abused by somebody in my home, another family member, when I was around 5 years old. And this abuse went on for a few years. And when I finally got the courage to tell my mom what was happening, I was around 11 or 12. And, she, I think, just struggled with how to respond because it was somebody else in the home. And so she didn't respond. And I became angry. I became resentful. And I started to rebel, and I started to look for, people who would care for me outside of my nuclear home. And that was the fertile, landscape that an older adult with sinister intentions needed to be able to come in and drive a further wedge between myself and my family. And that's what happened. And I met my abuser when I was in the Boy Scouts of America. She was a parent of another Boy Scout in my Boy Scout troop. She was at that time, a 27, 28-year-old woman. I was 13 years old. I had just finished my 7th grade year in middle school. And, and I was looking for somebody to care for me. I should also say in my family, we had a lot of people in my house. My cousins lived with us because their father was incarcerated. I had other sisters and my nephew and niece living with us. So you had all these kids dealing with tons of trauma and just really not enough parental supervision, to be quite honest with you, to sort of keep an eye on me. And this woman ended up sexualizing the relationship, just like many child victims of sexual abuse or trafficking. It starts off through a grooming process where they get your trust by offering you things. Like in Sarah's case, it was ice cream, right? For me, it was going to fast food and to movies and doing things that we didn't have the money to do growing up. And so I felt comfortable with this person. I thought that they cared for me. I actually thought that they loved me. And then over time, slowly, that relationship becomes sexualized. And for me, I was basically in a cycle of violence where emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse was ongoing. And I always felt like it was my fault. And that's what allowed this person to create this, what we call a traumatic bond with me. And when you have a traumatic bond with an older adult when you're a child, you have this misplaced sense of loyalty and love and devotion to this person that you think cares about you, but really is nefarious with their intentions. And she was able to get me to run away from home. I moved out. I moved in with her family. And that's where she was able to take advantage of that traumatic bond by basically turning me into a live-in domestic servant. I was cooking, cleaning, taking care of her younger children, all the while being physically and emotionally abused, being called the N-word, just really horrible things that were meant to denigrate me and to make me so reliant on her for that continual emotional connection and love that I thought that she had for me. And so I was in that situation for about, 2.5 years, from, the end of my 7th grade year in middle school through, the middle of my sophomore year in high school. And, thankfully, with the help of coaches and other mentors in my life, I was eventually able to break free of that manipulative hold that she had over me. And I moved back in with my parents and, was able to finish high school and become a first-generation college graduate.
I suppose it's so interesting to know, because someone who goes through something as traumatic as that, you could go in two different directions. You could absolutely end up going straight down and becoming a criminal and doing some terrible things, getting into drugs, or you came out and it motivated you to go and try and do good, to try and change what had happened to other people. And I'm just so interested in trying always in this podcast to understand, what gives you, some people, the ability to come out of it and grow something positive, and others who are unable to do that?
Yeah, well, let me start by saying, it wasn't all smooth sailing for me. And this is the point that I try to bring up a lot of times with people, was that, for kids who go through traumatic events like that, and they have trauma in their backgrounds that's unaddressed, it's going to manifest itself in some way. And for me, as an adolescent boy, I did get into trouble. I was lucky. I never got caught for anything, I should say. Right. But breaking and entering, vandalism, underage drinking, smoking marijuana, school fights. Around the time that the abuse first started happening, I think it was my 8th grade year in middle school, I probably was suspended at least 2 or 3 times for different fights that I was getting into. I was very emotionally, I would say, unhinged at that time because I was constantly being gaslit, right? And so you don't really understand what's happening. You think kind of everyone out is out to get you. And that's kind of how I was made to think. And so I responded to a lot of situations with violence, unfortunately. I also started hanging out with, the wrong crowd. I was around kids, in my neighborhood who were gang involved, and I had guns pulled out on me. I was shot at. There were lots of things that happened in my life that, had I not had other structures in place, to your point, it could have gone really poorly for me. But I just want to bring that up because, even though I was able to come out of that situation, I still was engaged in very problematic behavioral issues that were delinquency in nature. And I was fortunate enough just never to become system involved. That being said, the other folks in my life that really, I think, created a foundation for me were my coaches, my high school football coaches, and my wrestling coach in particular. They say, after you wrestle, everything else in life is easy. And I think part of that stems from the fact that, you go through, in wrestling, you go through so much adversity physically and mentally. And, my coach was fond of saying, it's not where you start, it's where you finish. And for a kid who was coming out of this very traumatic situation, who is really looking for another adult to kind of, believe in them and sort of lift them up and to show them another way. Eric really became that for me. And, and I'm incredibly grateful and thankful for that because I think, if there's one thing I could pinpoint, it would be, my coaches on the wrestling mat and on the football field who provided that foundation of discipline and hard work and showed me that, I don't have to be a victim of my circumstance, that I can overcome that if I'm willing to work hard enough and to pour my heart and soul into something. And that has laid the foundation for the rest of my life and how it unfolded.
Yeah, it's so interesting. But just before you answered that, I was going to ask, what can we do to prevent these sort of traumatic events happen? What do we do to society? And I think that you just answered it. I mean, it's community, it's leaders, it's making sure that family is still strong. I don't know. Do you think that is getting better and changing across the country, or do you think that those real, strong bonds, those strong leaders, are we still struggling to find enough of them?
Yeah, it's a great question. I oftentimes tell people, I wish people could see America the way that I see it through my eyes. And that's in part because I think there's a tendency when we watch the news to think that things are so polarized and so divided. But I've spent my career traveling across the country, working with some of the most conservative Republicans you can think of and some of the most liberal Democrats. And what I oftentimes come across with these people is that they're incredibly dedicated to wanting to make America the best place that it possibly can be. They're incredibly dedicated to our children and wanting to make the system as fair and as flexible for them to make sure that they have what they need to succeed in life. And sometimes there's differences, right, in how people approach things from just an ideological perspective. But I think going back to the intention that people have is really key. And that's what I've noticed. And that's why on our board, we've been able to function so well with folks who come from different walks of life and different political persuasions. I'll also note that, so often I see people who want to give back and get engaged. When I was coming up as a law student and as a young man, I was a volunteer with Big Brothers Big Sisters in the 3 different cities that I lived in. And I saw, the impact that has on young children who, don't have a mother or the father figure in their life. And I see so much people wanting to be engaged in this way. And that's really, to your point about community. It's about taking on that sacrifice ourselves, carrying our cross and saying that, you know what, like this child's circumstance may not be directly, related to what's happening in my life, but I'm going to care. So I'm going to go out there. I'm going to be a volunteer with whatever it is, Boy Scouts, Big Brothers, Big Sisters. I'm going to be a volunteer coach. Because that's the thing too, for me, so many coaches I had over the course of my life, they were volunteers. These were folks who were not getting paid a lot of money to do what they were doing and wanted to pour themselves into, a vulnerable kid who they felt, with the right guidance and support could have a chance in life. And, I oftentimes refer to these people as like these guardians, right? Because you never know what's happening in a child's life, and you never know if what you say in a single moment might be the thing that turns their life around. Just a point of reference too, if I can tell a quick story. One of the most incredible, things that I've witnessed in terms of people really pouring themselves into children actually happens out in Utah, the great state of Utah, and in Salt Lake City in particular. The Mormon missionaries out there do an incredible work of really living their Christian faith and their values. And I've never been to a state or state legislature where more legislators have been into their prison systems than in Utah. It's really a testament to the people there. But I was invited years ago, I think it was 2016, so almost 10 years ago, to go with a group of missionaries into a juvenile detention center in Salt Lake City. And I had a colleague there who was formerly incarcerated himself and gave this really amazing 2.5-hour speech to these young men. And afterwards, we went into one of the pods, and there were probably, like 15, 20 kids in these pods, and we're all just sitting around, and they bring out milk and cookies, just milk and cookies. And you have these, missionaries just sitting there, just talking with these kids. We're joking about sports and just listening to what's important to them and what they care about. And these were kids who range in age from 11 to 17. Some kids were in there for just, simple assaults. Other kids were in there for things as serious as homicide. And in this moment, in this, 3 hours that I got to spend, with these missionaries and with, these kids, you just saw adults sitting there listening to these kids, joking with them, letting them know that they're cared for and that they're loved. And that is fundamentally what it comes down to, is being able to show a child that they're cared for, that they're loved. Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, had a famous quote that he said, all things in life, lead back to love or the lack of it. And so when we pour ourselves into kids that we don't know, that we show them that they're loved and cared for by strangers, that's the thing that oftentimes can make the biggest difference for kids that don't have that in their lives.
Yeah. Get involved. Just go out and get involved in any way you can to try and help anybody around you. And it's absolutely, you're right when you say you never quite know what someone's life is at home, until you sit and talk to them. Do you think perhaps that many people across the country just write off kids like that? They commit these serious crimes when they're young, and that's it. Like getting back into society, getting a job again, doing all those things. I mean, it's really hard. And I think, do you think that maybe people don't sometimes give enough thought to maybe what they've gone through, or want to give them a second chance?
I think that's definitely true. I also think that it's important for us as a society to be able to hold very complex and nuanced thoughts on these issues, because, for us as an organization, we have a lot of former prosecutors, on our board too. We don't come at this issue from saying, just because a kid, went through very traumatic circumstances and they committed a serious crime doesn't mean that they shouldn't be held accountable. Sometimes public safety dictates that, a child has to be removed from their home or their community, and sometimes for extended periods of time. The question for us is always one of degree, is, asking the question, what happened in this child's life? How does that relate to the underlying behavior? And how do we get them the treatment and resources that they need to get back on the right path? And and I think that's where we start to fail as a society. And the system really wasn't set up to grapple with some of these issues, in part because, we don't ask that question. Why is this child here? What happened in their life that, put them on this path? And, the kids who don't go through abusive situations, generally speaking, don't end up in the justice system. They just don't. There are some exceptions, right, where there's a kid who comes from relatively, good background, like ends up committing a crime or even sometimes a serious crime. But, those are the very rare exceptions. Most of the kids that we see, again, come from those backgrounds where there's physical, emotional, sexual abuse, broken homes, etc. And the question that I think that would be great for more people to ask themselves is, what should we do knowing that background of children? Because I think when you tell people, oh, there's a child who's been sexually abused or trafficked or raped, I think that the first inclination that we have is to have sympathy and empathy for that child. And I think the image that comes up for a lot of people is a little girl or a little boy in a corner clutching a teddy bear. We have sort of these images. And what we like to pose to people is, now imagine that same little boy or that little girl being physically and sexually and emotionally abused over and over and over for years without being identified. And then they become a teenager and they're angry and they're resentful and there's no one there to care for them. And they're in a community rife with violence. And then they start to act out behaviorally because of that. It doesn't change the fact that this child was victimized severely. And it should inform the way that we approach how we hold them accountable, regardless of what the offense is. And like I said, sometimes that means that there's going to be, more serious consequences, but it should mean that we also do everything we can to give flexibility to the system and to really encourage the system to focus on treatment and services and holding that child accountable in a trauma-informed way.
More of our conversation right after this. There are, some cases that really stand out to me. Sarah Cruzen, if that's how you pronounce it, and is just a prime example of someone, who, a vulnerable child who went on to commit a crime, and then, I get Governor Schwarzenegger eventually overturned her. Could you explain a little bit about her case as well, her story?
Absolutely. So I first came across Sarah's case when I was a baby lawyer straight out of law school. I was working at an anti-trafficking organization called Polaris Project, also based in Washington, D.C. And there was an effort underway at that time to get then Governor Schwarzenegger, to commute Sarah's sentence. Sarah had been sentenced to life without parole for having killed her sex trafficker when she was just 16 years old. This was a man who found her when she was walking home from elementary school one day when she was just 11 years old and lured her into his car with the promise of ice cream, essentially. And that started a path for Sarah where she was sexually abused and raped from the time she was 11 to 13, and then forced into commercial sexual exploitation from 13 to 16, and then eventually ran away and returned and shot and killed her trafficker. And for me, in Sarah's case, I never thought that what happened with her was obviously justice. I think most people who have parents or children rather have this sense that if their child was raped or molested or trafficked, that the idea of sentencing that child to life without parole for having killed that person is just a manifest injustice. And I think a lot of people have recognized that. But I'll say this about Sarah's case too, is that unfortunately it's not an anomaly. At Human Rights for Kids, actually Sarah works with us now, and one of her projects is identifying other children who are incarcerated around the country for situations similar to hers, where they basically killed or acted out against their abuser or trafficker.
When in Sarah's original case, what went wrong there? Was her background talked about? Obviously, they must have said this is her background. She was, trafficked from the age of 11. This should be considered. What's changed between then and now, or was that not raised?
She had a great attorney at trial, and he did try to get some of this mitigating evidence into the record. The problem was, this was 1994 when her case happened, and so this was before there was really a national awakening and understanding of what human trafficking was. It was before the Federal Trafficking Victims Protection Act or state laws against trafficking, really. So part of, I think, what happened in Sarah's case was just a lack of understanding at that time, too. This is during the super predator era, and so there was this thought that, children who end up in the justice system, and, particularly girls in situations like Sarah, was that they were basically making a willing choice, that they wanted to be with this guy and that they wanted to participate in their exploitation. And we know so much more now. I would say, I would hope that we would have different outcomes today, but unfortunately, I think time and time again, we continue to see these cases where that's simply not the case. About a year and a half ago, a judge in Wisconsin sentenced another young girl who was 16 when she killed her molester and trafficker to 12 years in prison for taking his life, and under very similar circumstances. And so, we definitely see this come up still across the country. And it's part of the reason why we need updated laws to make sure that judges are considering, this mitigating evidence that is presented at trial, particularly around children's victim status, either as a trafficking victim or a survivor of sexual abuse. And then making sure that, we put in place the ability of judges to deviate from mandatory minimums. Sometimes judges are bound by mandatory minimums, no matter what the mitigating evidence is. And so that's also why it's important that lawmakers update their criminal statutes.
I can't remember the name of the two brothers in California.
The Menendez brothers.
The Menendez brothers. Is that something that would sort of fall under your sort of remit, the sort of thing that you're looking at?
So we only focus on people who were under the age of 18 when they committed their offenses. And so they were a little bit older. I mean, I will say that, when you're talking about 18, 19-year-olds, in terms of the brain development science and whatnot, that there's a lot of similar dynamics. But for our organization, Human Rights for Kids, we're just focused on those children who are age 17 or younger.
What is the scale of this? Like, how many cases are there of people who were sentenced under that age who, should have their sentences cut?
Yeah, it's a great question. Every year there's about 54,000 children who are tried as adults in the United States of America. A couple of years ago, with the help of the Polsinelli law firm, Human Rights for Kids actually conducted a survey, and we found that there were about 32,000 people in our state prison systems for crimes that they'd committed as children. So it was about 3% of the overall state prison population. And then over the last 2 years, we've been conducting, and this is some of the work that Sarah's been leading for us, we've been conducting adverse childhood experiences surveys to identify what were sort of the traumas that these people experienced in their childhood that maybe contributed to or led to their involvement in the justice system. And what I'll say from a sort of a big picture macro level is that we've identified people, about 70% of the kids who end up being tried as adults experience both physical and emotional abuse. About 40 to 45% experience sexual abuse prior to their system involvement. We're starting to also identify trafficking survivors as well. And so it kind of varies, again, based on the state, but I'll give you an example. Like California, where Sarah's case happened, there's about 38% of the people that we identified there in their prison systems experienced some form of human trafficking, whether it was labor trafficking, forced criminality, or sex trafficking, and sometimes a combination of all three of those. And so we are seeing more and more, the realization rather that the children who end up in the adult criminal justice system were oftentimes victims long before they were offenders. And there is this prevalence of that trauma contributing to their underlying cases. We're working right now to identify more and more of these cases. So far, we've identified about 18 across the country where people were convicted of having committed a crime against a person who had sexually abused, raped, or trafficked them prior to them becoming incarcerated. And so that's kind of the number that we have right now, specifically on cases like Sarah's.
Yeah. Wow. Well, James, thank you so much for joining me today and for all the work you do. And, keep doing it. And I guess we wish you all the best.
Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you for your work as well. You're a hero, and reading up on you, I was just so impressed, and I love the work that you're doing. So thank you for having me, and thank you for being one of these unsung heroes as well.
Oh, I appreciate it. You too. Thank you. Thanks for listening to Searching for Heroes. Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcasts Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.